The officer thought the darkness belonged to him. On a lonely Georgia highway, with no witnesses in sight, he believed a badge, a weapon, and one carefully written lie would let him decide what happened next. He chose a calm black driver, searched his vehicle without cause, dismissed a federal military credential as fake, and threatened to make the man disappear. What he could not see was the silent distress signal leaving the driver's wrist. What he could not hear was a military command center recording every word. And before that officer understood whom he had targeted, the horizon would fill with armored vehicles, disciplined soldiers, and a level of authority he could neither bully nor outrun. Dusk had just begun to settle over the sprawling pine forests of southern Georgia, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Colonel Malcolm Reddick navigated his slate-gray Chevrolet Tahoe down the two-lane expanse of County Route 9. I was exhausted, but it was a deeply satisfying kind of exhaustion. A seasoned officer with decades of active duty service behind him, Malcolm had seen the worst the world had to offer. From the blistering, dust-choked streets of Fallujah to the unforgiving mountains of the Korengal Valley, he had built a career on maintaining absolute composure under devastating pressure. Now, as the garrison commander of Fort Ashford, one of the largest military logistics and training installations on the East Coast, his battles were mostly fought behind a desk, managing budgets, base security, and the welfare of tens of thousands of soldiers and their families. He was in civilian clothes, a crisp navy blue polo shirt and neatly pressed khaki trousers, returning from a weekend leadership conference in Atlanta. The radio hummed quietly with a classic jazz station, providing a soothing soundtrack to the monotonous hum of his tires against the asphalt. He had set his cruise control precisely to the posted speed limit. As a man who enforced regulations for a living, he was meticulous about following them himself. He was not far from the reinforced gates of Fort Ashford, looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and a decent night of sleep. Then the headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. They were moving fast, aggressive, closing the distance with alarming speed. Malcolm instinctively tapped his brakes to disengage the cruise control, assuming the driver behind him was in a rush and would pass on the dotted yellow line. Instead, the vehicle practically glued itself to the Tahoe's rear bumper. Malcolm glanced in the mirror, his sharp eyes catching the faint, unmistakable silhouette of a push bar and the low profile of a light bar mounted on the roof. It was a local police cruiser. Briarwood County Sheriff's Department, most likely. Briarwood was a notoriously problematic jurisdiction. It was a small, economically depressed municipality that bordered the federal lands of Fort Ashford. The town practically funded itself on predatory traffic citations, and the local department had a dark, poorly kept reputation for racial profiling. Malcolm knew the statistics. His own provost marshal had briefed him multiple times about junior enlisted minority soldiers being harassed, searched without cause, and slapped with exorbitant fines while driving through Briarwood. Malcolm's hands tightened slightly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He watched the mirror. The cruiser tailed him for several miles, weaving slightly, trying to find a reason, any reason, to initiate a stop. Malcolm maintained a steady 55, keeping his vehicle perfectly centered in the lane. Suddenly, the night exploded in a blinding array of strobe lights. Red and blue bounced off the tall pines lining the highway, illuminating the dark cabin of the Tahoe. Malcolm let out a slow, controlled breath. He engaged his right turn signal, smoothly decelerating and pulling the heavy sport utility vehicle onto the wide gravel shoulder. He placed the vehicle in park, turned off the engine, and rolled down each window. It was a standard safety measure meant to show that he had nothing to hide. He turned on the interior dome light, illuminating the cabin, and placed both of his large, steady hands flat on the top of the steering wheel. He waited. In the rearview mirror, he watched the driver's side door of the cruiser swing open. Officer Brennan Voss stepped out. Voss was a man in his 30s with a tightly shaved head, an aggressive, strutting walk, and a tactical vest that looked more suited for a special weapons and tactics raid than a rural traffic patrol. Despite the fading light, Voss wore mirrored sunglasses. His right hand rested casually, yet deliberately, on the butt of his holstered Glock 17. Behind him, emerging from the passenger side, was a younger, thinner officer, Officer Gavin Mercer, a rookie barely out of the academy. Mercer hung back near the trunk of the Tahoe, his posture rigid and nervous, while Voss approached the driver's side window. Voss didn't bother with a greeting. He leaned in close, invading the space. The harsh scent of cheap cologne and chewing tobacco wafted into the pristine interior of the Tahoe. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Voss snapped, his tone dripping with unearned authority and barely concealed contempt. "Good evening, officer," Malcolm replied, his voice a deep, calm baritone. "My license is in my wallet, in my back right pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. I will need to reach for them. Is that all right with you?" Voss chewed on his gum, his jaw working rhythmically. He seemed annoyed that Malcolm knew the protocol, annoyed that he wasn't flustered. "Just get the documents. Keep your hands where I can see them." Moving with deliberate, slow precision, Malcolm retrieved his wallet, extracted his Georgia driver's license, and then leaned over to pop the glove box, pulling out the neatly folded paperwork. He handed them through the window. Voss snatched the documents. He shined a high-lumen tactical flashlight directly into Malcolm's eyes, an unnecessary and aggressive move designed to disorient. Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply narrowed his eyes against the glare, his expression completely unreadable. "Malcolm Reddick," Voss read aloud, mispronouncing the last name slightly, stretching it out as if mocking the syllables. "Address in Fort Ashford." "What are you doing out here, Malcolm?" "I'm traveling home from Atlanta," Malcolm answered politely. "Whose car is this?" Voss asked, shining the light around the back seats, looking for any excuse. "It is my vehicle." "The registration in your hand confirms that," Malcolm replied. Voss sneered, tapping the license against his chin. "You seem pretty relaxed for a guy who was swerving all over the road back there." "I have been driving exactly 55 miles per hour with my cruise control engaged, officer. I have not swerved," Malcolm stated, his tone remaining neutral, though the internal alarms were fully activated. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was a fishing expedition, and Voss was looking for a fight. "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" Voss's voice dropped an octave, the racial slur hanging heavily in the humid air, a toxic, undeniable poison. Malcolm's gaze hardened. Decades earlier, that word might have sparked a fire in him that would have ended his career before it began. But Colonel Malcolm Reddick was a master tactician. He knew exactly what this petty tyrant was trying to do. "I am stating a fact regarding my driving," Malcolm said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I suggest you run my information so I can be on my way." Voss's face flushed red beneath the mirrored lenses. He pointed a thick, calloused finger an inch from Malcolm's nose. "You don't tell me how to do my job. You sit tight, and you keep your hands glued to that wheel." Voss spun on his heel and marched back to his cruiser, leaving Malcolm sitting in the illuminated cabin, the heavy blanket of the Georgia night pressing down around him. Inside the police cruiser, the air conditioning blasted, but Officer Brennan Voss was boiling. He threw Malcolm's license and registration onto the center console and aggressively typed the information into the mobile data terminal. In the passenger seat, Rookie Officer Gavin Mercer shifted uncomfortably. "He seemed pretty cooperative, Brennan. Speed limit was fine. Plates are clean. Let's just give him a warning and cut him loose." Voss shot the younger man a withering glare. "You see the way he looked at me? Arrogant. Thinks he's better than us. I know his type, Mercer. Driving a $50,000 sport utility vehicle, wearing nice clothes. Guys like him, they're usually moving something. Drugs, cash, stolen goods. He's hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is. The system says he's got no record, completely spotless," Mercer pointed out, gesturing to the green text on the glowing screen. "That just means he hasn't been caught yet." Voss grunted, unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'm going to pull him out. We're tossing the car." Mercer's eyes widened. "Brennan, we don't have probable cause for a search. He didn't commit a moving violation." I smell marijuana. Boom. Probable cause, Voss said with a chilling, practiced ease. He patted his sidearm and opened the door. Watch my six, rookie, and learn how it's done. Back in the Tahoe, Malcolm watched the two officers via his side mirror. His military instincts, honed over decades of threat assessment, read their body language perfectly. The rookie was hesitant, submissive. The senior officer was agitated, acting on ego rather than procedure. This situation was about to deteriorate rapidly. Malcolm subtly moved his left wrist, positioning his secure wrist communicator just out of the line of sight from the window. With precise, practiced movements of his right fingers, he navigated to a custom application he had mandated for his senior command staff. It was a direct, encrypted distress and communications relay linked to the Fort Ashford Provost Marshal's office, the headquarters of the military police. He tapped the icon twice. The watch vibrated once, a silent confirmation that an open microphone channel was now broadcasting live audio directly to the dispatch desk of Major Elias Ward. Voss swaggered back to the driver's side window, slapping his palm against the roof of the Tahoe with a loud, aggressive bang. "All right, Malcolm. Step out of the vehicle," Voss commanded. Malcolm did not move his hands from the steering wheel. "Officer, could you please explain why I am being ordered out of my vehicle? You have my information, and it is clear. I don't have to explain a damn thing to you," Voss snarled, his hand dropping to rest heavily on the grip of his Glock. The snap of the holster retention strap being released echoed sharply in the quiet night. "Step out of the car right now, or you're going to find yourself on the pavement." "Officer, am I under arrest?" Malcolm asked, projecting his voice clearly so the microphone on his wrist would pick up every syllable. "You're about to be if you don't unbuckle that seatbelt and get out of this car," Voss threatened. "I am complying with your order under duress," Malcolm stated firmly. He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the muggy evening air. Tall and broad-shouldered, Malcolm towered over the slightly shorter police officer, his physical presence commanding and imposing despite his civilian attire. Voss immediately took a half-step back, intimidated by Malcolm's sheer size and the unyielding, fearless stare he was receiving. To compensate for his sudden insecurity, Voss turned up his aggression. He grabbed Malcolm by the shoulder and spun him around, slamming him chest first against the side of the Tahoe. Legs spread, hands on the roof. Voss barked. Malcolm complied, gritting his teeth as the hot metal of the sport utility vehicle pressed against his chest. He felt Voss's hands roughly patting down his waist, his legs checking for weapons. "Stand back there," Voss ordered, pointing to the space between the Tahoe and the police cruiser. Mercer was standing there, looking pale and miserable. Malcolm walked over slowly and stood beside the rookie, keeping his hands clasped casually in front of him. "I am notifying you that I do not consent to any search of my vehicle," Malcolm announced clearly, looking directly at Voss. Voss just laughed, a cruel, grating sound. "I don't need your consent. I smell contraband." Voss pulled a flashlight from his belt and dove into the Tahoe. He began tearing the immaculate interior apart. He yanked the contents out of the center console, throwing charging cables, breath mints, and receipts onto the floorboards. He pulled the seats forward, ripped up the heavy rubber floor mats, and rummaged through the glove compartment, scattering Malcolm's maintenance records everywhere. Malcolm watched with a stoic expression. But beneath the surface, a cold, calculated fury was building. This was a violation. It was an assault on his dignity, his property, and his constitutional rights. He glanced sideways at Mercer. "Are you comfortable with what your partner is doing, officer?" Malcolm asked quietly. Mercer swallowed hard, refusing to make eye contact. "Just keep quiet, sir. Let him do his job." "This isn't his job," Malcolm replied softly. "And your silence makes it yours." Inside the Tahoe, Voss popped the rear liftgate. The trunk space was mostly empty, save for a heavy olive-drab canvas duffel bag, Malcolm's military go-bag, which he kept with him at all times per base regulations. Voss grabbed the bag by the handles and hauled it out, dropping it onto the gravel shoulder with a heavy thud, He unzipped it aggressively. Inside were a spare pair of combat boots, neatly rolled army combat uniforms, a tactical vest, and there a small zippered pouch containing Malcolm's official government credentials. Voss tossed the uniforms aside and grabbed the small pouch, unzipping it. He pulled out a thick plastic card. He shined his light on it. It was a United States Department of Defense Common Access card. It bore Malcolm's photograph, a barcode, and his rank. Voss froze for a second, staring at the card. The rank insignia was an eagle. The text identified Malcolm Reddick as a colonel in the United States Army and the garrison commander of Fort Ashford. For a rational man, this would be the moment to freeze, apologize profusely, put the bag back, and walk away. But Brennan Voss's ego was far too fragile for rationality, and his racial bias ran far too deep. Instead of realizing he had just illegally searched the vehicle of one of the highest-ranking military officials in the state, Voss convinced himself of a different reality. He marched back to where Malcolm was standing, waving the common access card in the air like a prize. "You think I'm stupid?" Voss spat, stopping just inches from Malcolm's face. "You think I don't know a fake ID when I see one?" "That is a federal government credential," Malcolm said calmly. "Bull," Voss hissed. "Someone like you does not get to be a colonel. Where did you steal this? Who did you buy this from?" The statement hung in the heavy, humid air, so openly prejudiced that it briefly defied logic. Colonel Malcolm Reddick looked down at the officer, his dark eyes boring into Voss with the weight of decades of command experience. "I suggest you run that identification through your dispatch officer," Malcolm said, his voice dropping an octave, possessing the quiet, lethal authority of a man who commanded thousands of armed soldiers. "Because you have just unlawfully detained and illegally searched the property of the garrison commander of Fort Ashford. You are operating beyond any reasonable basis for this detention, and you are treading into federally actionable territory." The words were precise, legally sound, and delivered without a hint of fear. To a bully like Voss, fearlessness was the ultimate insult. Voss's face contorted into an ugly, hateful mask. He glanced quickly at Mercer. "Go sit in the cruiser, rookie. Now." Mercer hesitated. "Brennan, if he's military, I said go sit in the damn car," Voss roared. Mercer flinched, looking helplessly at Malcolm for a fleeting second before turning and scurrying back to the patrol car, shutting the door behind him. Now they were alone in the narrow space between the vehicles. Voss reached up to the center of his tactical vest. With a deliberate, loud click, he turned off his body camera. The small red recording light died. Malcolm's pulse remained steady, but his mind raced. The turning off of a body camera was the universal preamble to police brutality. It was the moment the uniform ceased to represent the law, and instead became a shield for criminal violence. "You think you're smart," Voss whispered, stepping so close that Malcolm could feel the heat radiating from the officer's agitated body. "You think using big words and flashing some fake plastic card makes you untouchable." Voss reached down and unclipped the retention strap of his holster again, leaving his hand resting heavily on the grip of his pistol. "Let me explain how things work out here in the real world, boy," Voss hissed, weaponizing the slur again. "Out here, on this dark road, I am the law. I decide what happens out here, and no one will question my report. I could put a bullet in your chest right now. I could tell the brass you went for my weapon. I could tell them you resisted. My rookie will back up every word I say. And you know what? A jury in this county will believe me. They'll pin a medal on my chest for taking scum like you off the street." Malcolm didn't blink. He didn't step back. He let the silence stretch for several long moments, ensuring that the microphone on his secure wrist communicator captured every single syllable of the death threat. "Are you threatening my life, officer?" Malcolm asked, his voice crystal clear. "I'm giving you a reality check," Voss sneered, pulling a heavy set of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around, hands behind your back. You're going to county lockup for possession of forged federal documents, resisting arrest, and whatever else I decide to write up when we get to the station. And I'm towing this fancy truck of yours." Malcolm calculated his options. He could easily disarm Voss. He had the training, the size, and the element of surprise. But doing so would validate Voss's narrative. It would result in a messy, potentially lethal physical altercation on the side of a highway. Malcolm was a strategist. He preferred absolute, overwhelming, undeniable victory. He slowly turned around and placed his hands behind his back. Voss slapped the cuffs onto Malcolm's wrists with vicious force, tightening them down until the steel bit painfully into the bone. "Let's see how arrogant you are sitting in a cage," Voss mocked, shoving Malcolm forward. He aggressively guided the colonel toward the back of the police cruiser, opened the door, and forced him to sit awkwardly in the cramped, hard plastic seat of the patrol car. The door slammed shut, locking from the outside. Inside the cruiser, it was sweltering. The partition separated Malcolm from the front seats. He watched through the reinforced glass as Voss walked over to the Tahoe, clearly inspecting it for a tow. What Officer Brennan Voss did not know was that inside the secure perimeter of Fort Ashford, absolute chaos had just been unleashed. In the subterranean dispatch center of the Provost Marshal's headquarters, Major Elias Ward had been listening. Ward, a hardened former ranger who had served under Colonel Reddick in Iraq, sat at his console, the blood draining from his face as the live audio fed through the speakers. He had heard the illegal search. He had heard the racial slurs. But when he heard the audible click of the body camera turning off, followed by an explicit threat against his commanding officer, Ward bypassed every standard operating procedure in the manual. Ward slammed his hand onto the red emergency lockdown button on his console. Sirens began to wail across the military police compound. "Dispatch, this is Provost Marshal Command." Ward barked into his headset, his voice cracking like a whip across the open frequency. "Declare a code black. The garrison commander has been illegally detained and directly threatened with lethal force by local law enforcement on County Route 9. The suspect has turned off his body camera. Repeat, the commander is under a direct lethal threat." The dispatch center exploded into motion. "Spin up the special reaction team." Ward roared, standing up from his desk and grabbing his own tactical gear. "I want the Bearcat vehicles rolling immediately. I want every available military police unit heavily armed and moving. Nobody, and I mean nobody, touches the colonel." Outside, the quiet night of the military base was shattered by the roar of heavy diesel engines. Two armored Lenco Bearcat vehicles, painted matte black and bristling with communication antennas, surged out of the motor pool. Behind them, a convoy of 6 military police sport utility vehicles, lights flashing, fell into a tight tactical formation. Inside the lead Bearcat, the commander of the Special Reaction Team, Captain Rowan Pierce, racked the bolt of his M4 carbine, his face painted with grim determination. They weren't responding to a routine disturbance or an active shooter. They were rolling out to rescue one of their own from a rogue cop. Back on Route 9, Officer Voss leaned against the hood of his cruiser, dialing the local tow company on his radio, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just kicked a hornet's nest, and the swarm was already descending. Inside the stifling confines of the Briarwood County patrol cruiser, Colonel Malcolm Reddick sat in absolute silence. The heavy steel handcuffs bit ruthlessly into his wrists, pinning his arms at an unnatural angle against the hard plastic molding of the back seat. The air conditioning in the rear compartment was either broken or deliberately turned off, and the humid Georgia heat was already beginning to pool in the cramped space, making every breath feel thick and heavy. Through the thick plexiglass partition, he could see Officer Brennan Voss standing near the front of the cruiser, a dark silhouette against the beam of the headlights. Voss had his radio microphone unclipped from his shoulder, casually calling in a civilian tow truck for Malcolm's Tahoe. The officer's posture was relaxed, arrogant, the stance of a man who believed he operated with absolute impunity. He occasionally laughed at something the dispatcher said, completely unaware of the invisible snare that had just snapped shut around him. Rookie Officer Gavin Mercer sat in the passenger seat staring straight ahead through the windshield. Even from the back seat, Malcolm could see the tension radiating from the young man's shoulders. Mercer knew a line had been crossed, multiple lines in fact, but he lacked the moral courage to stop his training officer. He was complicit by his silence, a dangerous trait in law enforcement, but one Malcolm recognized from decades of leadership. Officers ruled by fear were often the first to break when the pressure shifted. Malcolm glanced down at his left wrist, restricted as it was. The face of his secure wrist communicator was pressed against his lower back, but he could feel a rhythmic, secondary vibration pattern. It was a silent acknowledgement from the Provost Marshal's dispatch center. The message was received. The cavalry was not just coming, it was already on the way. The first sign of their arrival wasn't visual, it was physical. It started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration in the asphalt beneath the police cruiser. The quiet nocturnal symphony of crickets and tree frogs in the surrounding pine forests suddenly went dead silent, as if the local wildlife had collectively sensed a massive predator entering their territory. The vibration steadily grew into a deep, guttural rumble that rattled the loose plastic paneling of the patrol car's interior. Voss paused his conversation with the tow dispatcher, frowning. He clipped the radio back to his vest and took a few steps toward the center of the dark highway, peering down the long, straight stretch of asphalt that led back toward Fort Ashford. Then, the horizon exploded in light. It wasn't the scattered flashing strobes of civilian police cars. It was a blinding, synchronized wall of military-grade lights cutting through the Georgia night like a laser. The convoy was moving at an astonishing speed, blowing past the civilian speed limits with terrifying, organized precision. "What the hell is this?" Voss muttered, his hand instinctively dropping to his duty belt. He squinted against the glare, trying to make sense of the approaching armada. "Mercer, get out here!" The rookie scrambled out of the passenger seat, slamming the door. "Is it State Patrol, Brennan? A pursuit?" "No," Voss said, his voice losing some of its cocky edge, replaced by a sudden, creeping uncertainty. "State troopers don't drive tanks." The lead vehicle came to a screeching, violent halt a short distance from Voss's cruiser. It was a massive Lenco Bearcat armored personnel carrier, painted matte black, devoid of any reflective police decals, bearing only the stark stenciled letters Military Police Special Reaction Team. Before Voss could even process the sight of the armored beast, a second Bearcat roared up beside it, angling its heavy chassis across the two lanes, completely blocking the northbound side of the highway. Behind the armor, 6 tactical sport utility vehicles formed a secondary perimeter, their doors already swinging open before the vehicles had fully stopped. "Hey!" Voss shouted, waving his arms, desperately trying to assert the authority he thought he possessed. "This is an active scene, Briarwood County jurisdiction. You need to back it up right now." The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. "Dismount. Form perimeter. Secure the high ground." The tactical commands barked over a powerful loudspeaker and tore through the night. The rear hydraulic doors of the Bearcat vehicles dropped open with a heavy metallic clang. Out poured more than 24 heavily armed military police soldiers. These were not regular base security guards. This was the Special Reaction Team, the military equivalent of a Special Weapons and Tactics unit, but trained for counterterrorism and high-threat neutralizations. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity that made Voss's heart slam against his ribs. Clad in full tactical gear, Kevlar helmets, and level 4 body armor, the soldiers instantly deployed into strategic firing positions. They utilized the engine blocks of their sport utility vehicles for cover, while a sniper team scrambled onto the reinforced roof of the lead Bearcat. Every single soldier was armed with an M4 carbine, and within moments of dismounting, every single barrel was pointed directly at Officer Brennan Voss. A dozen red laser sights cut through the humid air, dancing across Voss's chest, neck, and face like a swarm of deadly fireflies. Voss froze, his bravado entirely evaporating. The sheer scale of the force deployed against him broke his mind. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping against the hood of his cruiser. In a panic-induced lapse of judgment, his hand twitched, his fingers wrapping around the grip of his unholstered Glock. "Do not touch that weapon," a voice thundered from the public address system, so loud it actually caused the sheet metal of Voss's cruiser to vibrate. "Drop your hand away from your firearm immediately. If you draw that weapon, you will be neutralized." Voss snatched his hand away from his hip, as if the gun was suddenly made of white, hot iron. He raised his hands to chest level, his palms facing outward, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Beside him, Officer Mercer let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper and immediately dropped to his knees, lacing his fingers behind his head and burying his face against the side of the police car. "I am a police officer," Voss screamed, his voice cracking, the deep southern drawl giving way to pure, unadulterated terror. "I am Briarwood County law enforcement. You have no jurisdiction here. Stand down. Stand down." From behind the lead Bearcat, a figure emerged, striding past the line of aimed rifles with absolute unbothered confidence. It was Major Elias Ward, the Provost Marshal of Fort Ashford. He was wearing his combat uniform, a plate carrier strapped tightly over his chest, his face set in a mask of cold, uncompromising fury. Flanking him was Captain Rowan Pierce, the Special Reaction Team commander, keeping his rifle at the low ready, his eyes locked onto Voss. Ward didn't use a megaphone as he closed the distance. He didn't need to. The absolute silence of the highway, save for the low hum of the diesel engines, amplified his voice perfectly. "Officer Brennan Voss," Ward said, the name sounding like a formal charge. "You do not dictate jurisdiction to me. You do not give orders to my men, and you are about to understand exactly how badly you have miscalculated." Major Ward stopped a short distance from Voss, just outside the striking distance of a desperate man, but close enough for Voss to see the cold, hard glint in the Provost Marshal's eyes. The red laser dot remained painted on Voss's chest, wavering slightly with his rapid, panicked breathing. Voss looked around frantically. He was cut off. The highway was blocked in both directions. The dark tree line offered no escape, and even if it did, he knew he wouldn't make it 3 steps before the armed perimeter stopped him. "You can't do this," Voss shouted, his voice trembling violently. He pointed a shaking finger at Ward. "We are on county property. I made a lawful traffic stop. I have a suspect detained in the back of my cruiser for possession of forged federal documents and resisting arrest. I am an officer of the law." Ward did not yell. He did not lose his temper. The quiet, lethal calm he projected was infinitely more terrifying than Voss's frantic screaming. "Let me explain the law to you, Officer Voss," Ward said, his voice a smooth, icy baritone. "Under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 372, it is a federal crime to conspire to impede or injure an officer of the United States. Furthermore, under Section 111, assaulting, resisting, or impeding a federal officer is a felony. You have unlawfully detained the garrison commander of a United States Army installation. You have illegally searched his vehicle, seized his government credentials, and most damningly, you directly threatened his life while acting under the color of law." Voss's eyes widened, the blood draining from his face until he was the color of dirty chalk. "How do you know?" "How do I know?" Ward interrupted, tapping the communications earpiece secured in his ear. "Because we heard every single word. We heard the racial slurs. We heard you illegally fabricate probable cause. And we heard the distinct sound of your body camera being deactivated right before you threatened to put a bullet in Colonel Reddick's chest." Voss looked down at his vest, staring at the small black square of his powered-down body camera as if it were a venomous snake that had just bitten him. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The man he thought was a helpless civilian, a man he targeted out of pure racial malice, was a highly decorated military commander who had been broadcasting the entire encounter directly to a heavily armed federal command center. He was swerving, Voss stammered, frantically trying to assemble a lie, grasping at the rapidly disintegrating shreds of his authority. "I smelled marijuana. I was following standard protocol for a felony stop." "Save it for the federal judge," Ward snapped, his patience finally evaporating. He gestured sharply to Captain Rowan Pierce. "Disarm him." Captain Rowan Pierce and 2 Special Reaction Team soldiers moved forward with startling speed. "Don't touch me. My sheriff will have your badges for this." Before Voss could finish the sentence, a soldier grabbed his right wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing Voss to spin around. A second soldier seized his left arm. In one fluid, practiced motion, they unclipped his duty belt, stripping away his Glock, his taser, his baton, and his handcuffs. The heavy belt fell to the asphalt with a loud clatter. "On your knees," Captain Rowan Pierce ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. Voss tried to resist, stiffening his legs. "You can't arrest a local cop. You have no civilian police powers here." Captain Rowan Pierce kicked the back of Voss's right knee. The joint buckled instantly, and Voss slammed down onto the hard gravel of the shoulder, crying out in pain and humiliation. A heavy combat boot pressed firmly against the center of his back, pinning him to the ground. "We are detaining you only long enough to protect federal personnel, preserve the scene, and transfer custody to civilian federal and state authorities," Ward stated with precise control. "Your badge does not give you control of this scene, Voss. At this moment, you are an armed threat accused of unlawfully detaining a federal official." While Voss was being forced into submission, 2 other Special Reaction Team soldiers moved to the side of the cruiser, where Officer Mercer was still kneeling on the ground, weeping openly, his hands clasped behind his head. "Don't shoot. Please, I didn't do anything." Mercer sobbed, his voice cracking. "I told him we didn't have probable cause. I told him to let it go. He wouldn't listen to me. I swear to God, I didn't want any of this." "Keep your hands on your head," a soldier instructed Mercer, patting him down for weapons and pulling his duty pistol from its holster. "Stand up. Face the car. Do not move." Ward ignored the blubbering rookie and marched straight to the rear passenger door of the Briarwood cruiser. He peered through the glass, locking eyes with Colonel Reddick. Despite the heat, the handcuffs, and the chaos outside, Malcolm's expression remained perfectly composed. Ward pulled the door handle. It was locked. He turned to look at the disgraced officer pinned to the asphalt. "Where are the keys, Voss?" Voss, his face pressed against the rough gravel, ground his teeth together. A final spark of defiance flared in his eyes. He remained silent. Captain Rowan Pierce simply nodded to one of his soldiers. The soldier pulled a heavy steel breaching tool, a mini Halligan bar, from his back panel. He wedged the heavy steel claw into the gap between the rear door and the frame of the cruiser. Wait, they're in my left cargo pocket." Voss screamed, realizing they were about to tear his expensive patrol car apart. A soldier reached into Voss's pocket, retrieved the keys, and tossed them to Ward. The major quickly unlocked the door and pulled it open, a blast of stale, stifling air hitting him in the face. Ward immediately reached in, producing a universal handcuff key. He quickly unfastened the heavy steel cuffs, gently guiding Malcolm's arms forward. "Are you injured, Colonel?" Ward asked, his tone shifting instantly from military aggression to deep, respectful concern. Malcolm rubbed his raw, indented wrists, grimacing slightly as the blood rushed back into his hands. He rolled his shoulders, taking a deep breath of the cooler night air. "I am unharmed, Major," Malcolm said, his deep voice remarkably steady. "Your response time was exemplary. We were tracking your vehicle's telemetry from the moment you activated the emergency relay, sir." "We had the Bearcat vehicles moving before he finished removing you from the car," Ward replied, stepping back and saluting sharply. Malcolm returned the salute, adjusting the collar of his polo shirt. He stepped out of the cramped cruiser, standing to his full, imposing height. He looked around the scene. The tactical perimeter was flawless. His soldiers were disciplined, holding their positions, neutralizing the threat without firing a single shot. It was a textbook operation. Then Malcolm's gaze drifted down to the ground, where Officer Brennan Voss was lying in the dirt, completely stripped of his weapons, his dignity, and his false sense of power. Malcolm walked slowly toward Voss. The Special Reaction Team soldiers stepped back slightly, giving the garrison commander space. Malcolm stood over Voss, looking down at the man who only moments earlier had called him a boy and threatened his life on the side of a dark highway. Voss twisted his neck to look up at Malcolm. The mirrored sunglasses had fallen off during the scuffle, revealing eyes wide with panic, disbelief, and a dawning realization of the catastrophic magnitude of his actions. The sneer was gone. The racial hatred had been entirely eclipsed by raw fear. "You thought the uniform gave you the right to be a predator," Malcolm said, his voice quiet, carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the military vehicles. You thought that darkness and a badge gave you permission to erase a man's rights and dignity because you did not like the color of his skin. "I was just doing my job," Voss choked out, a pathetic, reflexive lie that he didn't even believe himself. "You were acting suspicious." "Your job is to protect and serve," Malcolm corrected him, his tone sharp as shattered glass. "But men like you don't care about service. You care about power. You look for the vulnerable. You look for the people who can't fight back. You pull over teenagers. You harass minorities. You extort the poor. And you hide behind the shield when someone questions you." Malcolm leaned down slightly, forcing Voss to maintain eye contact. "But tonight, you picked the wrong man. You picked a man who has spent decades defending the Constitution that you just wiped your boots on. And you picked a man who commands an army." Malcolm stood back up, turning his attention to Major Ward. "What is the status of civilian law enforcement?" "I bypassed Briarwood County Dispatch entirely, sir," Ward reported. "I contacted the director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Regional Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in Atlanta the moment we deployed. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation team is approaching now. We will hold the perimeter and maintain custody until they arrive to formally process the arrest." As if on cue, the wail of sirens pierced the night from the opposite direction. 3 sleek, unmarked black Dodge Chargers, their grills flashing with blue and white strobes, tore down the highway, pulling up behind the military blockade. 4 men in suits and tactical vests, bearing the words, "Georgia Bureau of Investigation," stepped out. Leading them was Special Agent in Charge Conrad Hale, a stern-faced veteran investigator who had built his career taking down corrupt local departments. Hale flashed his badge as he walked through the perimeter, taking in the surreal sight of the armored military vehicles and the local cop pinned to the asphalt. Hale walked straight to Malcolm, extending his hand. "Colonel Reddick, I am Special Agent in Charge, Conrad Hale, with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I received Major Ward's briefing on the way here. I apologize that you had to experience this in our state, sir." "Thank you, Agent Hale," Malcolm said, shaking the man's hand firmly. "Major Ward has the audio recordings of the entire encounter secured on our servers." Hale nodded grimly. He turned to look at Officer Gavin Mercer, who was still leaning against the patrol car, shaking like a leaf. "What about the rookie?" Hale asked. Malcolm looked at Mercer. He remembered the young man's hesitation, his weak protests that were ultimately silenced by his fear of his training officer. "Officer Mercer was complicit," Malcolm said evenly. "However, he did attempt to de-escalate prior to the physical altercation. I believe you will find him highly motivated to cooperate as a witness for the state." Hale caught the implication immediately. He walked over to Mercer. "Your career in local law enforcement is over, but whether you spend years in federal prison alongside your partner depends entirely on whether you tell the complete truth now. Do we understand each other?" Mercer nodded frantically, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I'll tell you everything. He does this all the time. He targets people. He plants things. He told me to keep my mouth shut or he'd ruin me. I'll testify to whatever you need. Just please don't put me in federal lockup." Hale sneered in disgust. He turned to his agents. "Get the rookie in the car. Process him." Hale then walked over to Voss. The Special Reaction Team soldiers stepped back, allowing the state agents to haul Voss to his feet. Hale pulled a pair of heavy cuffs from his belt. "Brennan Voss," Hale recited, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "You are under arrest by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. You are being charged with aggravated assault under color of law, false imprisonment, deprivation of civil rights, and making terroristic threats. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will also review federal kidnapping charges." The cuffs closed around Voss's wrists, completing a reversal no one present could ignore. Voss began to hyperventilate. "My sheriff won't let you do this," Voss cried out, a desperate final plea to the corrupt system that had sheltered him for so long. "He'll call the governor. You can't just take me." Hale chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Your sheriff is currently having his home raided by my agents as we speak, Voss. Your entire department is being dismantled. You're done. Put him in the back of my car." Voss was dragged away, his legs practically dragging on the asphalt, his spirit entirely broken. He was placed in the back of the unmarked Charger, and the door closed firmly behind him. The compartment he had once used to frighten others now held him as a prisoner. Major Ward turned to Malcolm. "Colonel, we have a driver ready to take your Tahoe back to base. You can ride with me in the command vehicle." Malcolm looked at his pristine sport utility vehicle, then at the flashing lights, the armored vehicles, and the faces of the soldiers who had rushed into the darkness to protect him. The accumulated exhaustion finally began to settle into his bones, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of pride in the men and women under his command. "No, Major," Malcolm said, reaching into his pocket for his spare set of keys. "I will drive my own vehicle, but I would appreciate an escort back to the gates." "It would be our honor, sir," Ward said, smiling faintly. Shortly afterward, the heavy military machines began to shift. The Bearcat vehicles pulled back, opening a lane on the highway. Malcolm climbed into the driver's seat of his Tahoe. He started the engine, the familiar hum a comforting sound after the chaos. He shifted into drive. As he pulled forward, the two massive armored Bearcat vehicles took up positions in front of and behind his vehicle, with the tactical sport utility vehicles flanking them on the sides. The convoy began to move, a formidable display of protective force rolling steadily towards the safety of Fort Ashford. In the rearview mirror, Malcolm watched the flashing blue lights of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation vehicles fade into the distance, taking Brennan Voss away to face a justice he could neither intimidate nor outrun. The dark Georgia highway was quiet once again, but the balance of power had been permanently shifted. The abusive officer had been caught by the consequences of his own choices, and lawful accountability had prevailed. Sunlight rose over the manicured parade grounds of Fort Ashford, casting long golden shadows across the pristine asphalt. Inside the garrison commander's headquarters, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the humid, chaotic terror of the earlier operation. The office was quiet, smelling of dark roast coffee and lemon polish. Colonel Malcolm Reddick sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, his dress uniform immaculate. The rows of ribbons on his chest were a silent testament to a lifetime of disciplined service. Later, there was a sharp knock on the heavy oak door. Major Elias Ward stepped into the office carrying a thick manila folder. His expression was tight with a mixture of satisfaction and professional grimness. "Good day, Colonel," Ward said, offering a crisp salute, which Malcolm promptly returned. "I have the preliminary debriefings from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sir. The fallout is extensive." "Give me the highlights, Elias," Malcolm said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. Ward opened the folder. "Officer Brennan Voss is currently being held without bail in a federal detention facility in Atlanta. United States Attorney Damian Cross has personally taken control of the prosecution. Cross isn't just pushing for deprivation of civil rights under color of law. He's hitting Voss with armed kidnapping of a federal official. Voss is facing a sentence measured in decades." Malcolm nodded slowly, his face impassive. "And the rookie?" Gavin Mercer told investigators everything he knew, Ward replied, a hint of disgust in his voice. "He traded his badge for immunity. He provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation with dates, times, and locations of dozens of illegal stops Voss orchestrated over recent years. But it gets worse, sir. When state agents impounded Voss's cruiser, they found a false panel in the trunk. Inside were 2 unregistered, defaced handguns and several bags of narcotics. Drop weapons? Voss had been carrying tools that could be used to frame innocent people. The sheer gravity of the corruption hung in the quiet office. Malcolm thought about the countless civilians, young soldiers, minorities, people without the rank or the resources to defend themselves, who had undoubtedly fallen victim to Voss's predatory tactics. He had stopped a dangerous officer, but the dangerous officer had been feeding for a long time. "What about the department itself?" Malcolm asked. Voss didn't operate in a vacuum. A man like that only thrives when leadership provides the shade. Ward allowed a fierce, restrained smile to touch his lips. The investigation went much deeper, sir. When Agent Hale told Voss his sheriff was being raided, he wasn't exaggerating. Soon afterward, the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided the Briarwood County Sheriff's Department and the personal residence of Sheriff Everett Brandt. They caught Brandt in his pajamas trying to feed financial ledgers into a heavy-duty paper shredder. Financial ledgers? Civil asset forfeiture abuse, Ward explained. Brandt and Voss were running a highway piracy ring. They were targeting out-of-state plates and minority drivers, seizing cash under the guise of suspected drug activity, and funneling the money into ghost accounts to fund the department and line their own pockets. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has stepped in. Soon afterward, the Briarwood County Sheriff's Department no longer operates independently. The town has been placed under a strict federal consent decree, and the Georgia State Patrol has formally assumed law enforcement duties in the county. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, absorbing the magnitude of the victory. He had only wanted to return home safely, yet his refusal to surrender his rights had exposed an entire system of corruption. It was a stark reminder of the fragile line between authority and tyranny. "Sir, the press is already circling," Ward added, closing the folder. "The Pentagon has issued a holding statement, but local news outlets have footage of our Bearcat vehicles on the highway. They are calling it a military standoff." "It wasn't a standoff," Malcolm corrected quietly. "A standoff implies two equal sides. That was a surgical extraction of a federal asset and the neutralization of a criminal threat. Refer all press inquiries to the Department of Justice. Let United States Attorney Cross take the podium. This is a matter for the civilian courts now. Understood, Colonel?" Ward stood, coming to attention. "For what it is worth, sir, the men and women in the Provost Marshal's office are exceptionally proud to serve under your command. They are proud that the team protected its commander without abandoning discipline or the law. Thank you, Major. And pass my commendations to Captain Rowan Pierce and his team. Their discipline during the operation was flawless." Dismissed. As Ward left the office, Malcolm turned his chair to look out the large window overlooking the base. Thousands of soldiers were going about their daily duties, training, preparing, completely unaware of the serious confrontation that had been fought and won just a few miles beyond the gates. Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out his Department of Defense Common Access card, the very piece of plastic that Brennan Voss had arrogantly dismissed as a fake. He turned the card over in his large, steady hands. True authority did not come from a badge, a gun, or the ability to instill fear in the vulnerable. True authority was rooted in restraint, integrity, and the unwavering commitment to the rule of law. Brennan Voss had searched for a victim in the darkness because he believed a badge made him untouchable. Instead, his own choices brought the full weight of lawful accountability into the open. Malcolm slipped the card back into his pocket, turned back to his desk, and got to work. True power is not measured by the volume of a voice, the weight of a weapon, or the fear a uniform can create. It is measured by restraint when anger would be easier, honesty when a lie would be more convenient, and the courage to protect another person's dignity, even when no one important appears to be watching. Malcolm Reddick remained calm because he understood that control and surrender are not the same thing. He followed physical commands to protect his life, but he never abandoned the truth. He spoke clearly, preserved the evidence, and allowed lawful institutions to examine what happened. His composure was not weakness. It was discipline shaped by decades of service and by a deep respect for the Constitution he had sworn to defend. Brennan Voss made a very different series of choices. His downfall did not begin when the military convoy appeared on the highway. It began much earlier, each time he treated prejudice as instinct, intimidation as leadership, and silence as permission. Every unlawful stop made the next one easier. Every complaint that disappeared convinced him that consequences belonged only to other people. By the time he encountered Malcolm, he had become so certain of his own authority that he could no longer recognize real strength standing quietly in front of him. Gavin Mercer's role carries another important lesson. He knew the search was wrong. He questioned his partner, but fear kept him from acting when intervention mattered most. Later cooperation helped investigators uncover a broader pattern, yet it could not erase the moment when he chose safety for himself over protection for another person. Still, telling the truth was better than continuing the lie. Responsibility begins when a person stops making excuses, admits what happened, and accepts the consequences of their choices. Accountability should never be confused with revenge. Malcolm did not use military power to invent charges, punish innocent people, or humiliate the officers for entertainment. The military police secured the commander, preserved the scene, and transferred the investigation to civilian state and federal authorities. Evidence was collected. Witnesses were interviewed. Courts and investigators were given the responsibility to determine guilt. That difference matters because justice loses its meaning when it becomes another excuse for uncontrolled power. Forgiveness can exist beside accountability. A person may release hatred without pretending that harm was harmless. A community may believe in second chances while still requiring honesty, restitution, and fair consequences. Forgiveness is not the removal of responsibility. Sometimes it is the decision not to let another person's cruelty control the rest of our lives. Most people will never face a convoy of armored vehicles on a dark highway, but nearly everyone will experience a smaller moment when another person's dignity depends on a choice. It may happen in a workplace, a classroom, a neighborhood, or a family. We may be asked to support an unfair accusation, laugh at a cruel remark, remain silent about misconduct, or protect someone from consequences simply because we know them. Those moments may not feel dramatic, but they shape the kind of world we live in. Kindness is not passive. Integrity is not soft. Speaking up calmly can be one of the bravest things a person does. The most honorable use of authority is not proving that others are powerless. It is making sure power is never used to deny someone their humanity. Malcolm returned to his desk because one victory could not finish the work. The corrupt department had been exposed, but trust would have to be rebuilt slowly. Wrongfully seized property would have to be traced. Past cases would need review. Victims would deserve to be heard. Honest officers would have to prove through daily conduct that service meant more than protecting a badge. That is the lasting message of this story. We cannot control every unfair person we encounter, but we can control whether we become like them. We can choose patience without surrendering our principles. We can choose courage without becoming cruel. We can choose responsibility after making a mistake. And we can choose to live in a way that leaves other people with more dignity, not less. If Malcolm's story stayed with you, share it with someone who believes authority should always answer to integrity. Support the channel for more dramatic stories about courage, accountability, hidden strength, and the moments when truth finally reaches the light. Then consider one quiet question. When speaking up could cost you comfort, approval, or security, would you still choose what is right?